when working with journalists to help them understand our issues better. And they also do amicus briefs and more. Shelby Chestnut, welcome. I think a first-timer here, right?
It is, yeah.
Okay. With the Transgender Law Center, which is the largest trans-specific, trans-led organization in the United States that advocates and works on precedent-setting litigation. They also are doing some tremendous narrative work. That's why they're here. There's, Shelby has a prop, I think, but there on your tables are some amazing guides that his staff, who are also here, put together around reproductive rights and other ways to accurately cover trans issues. And last but not least, Kiera Johnson, who's the president of the National LGBTQ Task Force, AKA our boss. We got quite a few task force folks here. And I asked Kiera to be here, not just because I would love to have my boss in front of a few hundred journalists. That's not a bad thing for a comms director, right? But because her voice is very unique and pivotal in how we move forward as a larger community and within our movements. It's not just that, we work at the intersections, we really lean into the diversity of our community in so many ways, but I think Kiera also brings an incredible vision and perspective on how to bring people to the table and really talk to them. And media is, one of the ways that we can start those conversations. So I'm really excited to hear from KJ, as we call her. So I'm gonna start off with a question really for all of you. We could just kind of go down the line. One of the biggest challenges we faced, and they've talked about it a lot at this conference, not this year, but forever, is what they call two-sidism, right? So in terms of covering all kinds of LGBTQ issues, talk about how we address that issue, especially from your perspective as folks who are fact-checking in the movement or, working on issues related to research and data. Erin, do you want to start?
Yes, absolutely. So, I think one of the underlying assumptions of both sidesism whenever it comes to covering any topic, but especially LGBTQ topics, is that you're fighting for coverage on symmetrical ground, that the ground is even, and that way you're going to get both sides of an issue. But that's not actually what we are seeing in our major media outlets right now. In fact, the game is extremely asymmetrical. I track anti-LGBTQ organizations and think tanks around the world. And just yesterday, we heard from somebody from the SPLC that, had developed a really incredible report that details the same things, all of the super well-funded organizations. And what we see is that these organizations spend a lot of money on developing writers, on developing stories that they then push to major media outlets. They're constantly churning op-eds to the New York Times, to the Washington Post, to every single newspaper outlet out there, to The Economist. And so what we end up with is that we're not actually getting both sides of the story at all. What we end up with is a massive deluge of anti-trans and anti-queer stories that are constantly being published. On the other side of that, on the other side of the both sides sort of coverage, are the trans and the queer journalists that also have so much to say on these issues. And so often, we are kept limited to LGBTQ publications. Our major media outlets are not seeking us out. They're not giving us equal ground to talk. I know that I've spoken to several trans writers, really good ones, who are incredibly they're so good at putting this information into words. And I can tell you that universally, the experience is nobody's publishing them. Nobody is accepting their submissions. Nobody's accepting their op-eds. Meanwhile, on the other side of things, we get this massive amount of acceptance, not only acceptance of anti-trans op-eds, but we're getting push notifications. So I keep track of the New York Times, and I know that we probably have some New York Times people here, and I've spoken to a few of them. But whenever, an anti-trans story comes out, an anti-trans op-ed comes out, I get a push notification on my phone that says, Hillary Cass review says that trans care doesn't work. But then the next day, whenever the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Endocrine Society write a response, that response ends up as number 6 in the letters to the editors in like page 39. So whenever we hear the people who like to push anti-trans and anti-queer coverage talk about both sidesism, they're not even staying true to that. That isn't what we're actually getting.
Awesome.
I'm waiting for y'all to clap. Oh, wow. I feel like I want to be your student. You just gave me a lot to think about in addition. Like, anyway, I'm just taking notes. That's what's so cool about this, right? It's like we get to learn from each other in the moment, right? Like, it's like we get to teach and learn at the same time. I'd also like to offer that both sides in and of itself is a flawed frame. We're talking about real people with real lives, with multiple identities, with a cultural context, a spiritual context, an economic context, right? Like, there are multiple perspectives, right, that we are wallowing in, wading in every minute of every day. So even this idea that there is a both sides, like, let's just stop pretending that that's even real when there might be 100 sides. So what if there are 100 sides? The reality is you can't cover them all any damn way. So then what are you trying to do? What's at the core, right? What is needed is a real analysis of what people are seeing, hearing, feeling, and experiencing as it relates to policy, right? And cultural actions, right? Like activities that are happening where we live every day. So what then does it look like, right, if it's not about sides and it's about learning and data and evolution and creating spaces where people don't often get heard, are given the space to be heard? What would it look like if we were hearing more, and this is to your point, right, like, there can be no balance if we're really considering capitalism, right? Racism, sexism, homophobia. There's no way you're getting a both sides because we don't hear from people. We're often invisibilized at best and then dismissed, right, as lunatics, right, at worst. And so then if we're not even hearing from our people, then both sides, right? Like it doesn't mean anything. It becomes very tropish of both sides. It makes us feel better, right? Then we say, no, we covered both sides. No, you didn't. You didn't cover all the 100 sides. And so I think it becomes really important to get at who each of you are and what gift can you give in the communities that you are networked in. Some of you, right, like have real hardline parameters, right? Like you've got to be, quote, objective, whatever that means. I'm a Gemini, what? Objective. We're so judgy. But objectivity, right? And then what is the data? Like, how do we get to the data? Like, what is the data that's missing? This is one of the #1 things that we're talking about in Washington, D.C., and I'm setting you up beautifully. People in Congress are making decisions about our community, and when you ask them what the data is they don't have any. Then there is no both sides if you don't even have the data to bring into your analysis. Right. Data is missing. And so this is something each and every one of you can become cuckoo bananas about. It is, where is the data? Dig in, because it's there. It's there. You might be talking to people. You might be going to local schools. You might be talking to queer people who are sitting in pews who are not on Instagram. But the data is there for the taking if you're willing to do that kind of journalism. And that's what our people need, is that kind of journalism.
I actually do want to go to Brad next real quick, because I think some of the work, particularly, I mean, from the very beginning, but particularly some of the early work of the Williams Institute was data, it was demographics, but what it was also was stereotype busting. Like, it really educated and opened our own eyes around the community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. And let me just start by saying this, is that kind of applying this standard or goal of presenting both sides is not something that's kind of universally or objectively applied. There's a subjective decision about when that comes into play. And I'll tell you about the founding of the Williams Institute. We were the first academic research center on LGBTQ rights, and I've been there since the beginning, since 2001. And in those early years, I had that standard applied to me as starting an academic research center on LGBTQ rights. And the standard was, does all of your research support the LGBTQ rights movement? Turned out it didn't, and we'll get into that and why that's important in a bit, I'm sure. But I was also asked to invite experts and speakers who were opposed to LGBTQ rights to present, which we actually did for a few years. We also had a center, one of the first centers, it's still a fantastic center on critical race theory. We had an environmental law center. We had centers, we have a Native Nation centers. The Environmental Law Center was never asked to invite big oil to come and present. And the Center on Climate Change was not asked to do that. The Critical Race Theories Study Center was not asked to invite racists to come and speak to prevent both sides. So both sides is something that is sought after when it's believed that there's a certain amount of contestation around an issue, and I think only comes into play when there's either an actual or belief that there's divided kind of public opinion on the issue. That there are things that cross out of the both sides framework once they receive such support. And I really appreciate the comments about we're in an asymmetrical landscape where the fact that some of these things are contested about our community is being manufactured. And so I think if we really take a hard look at that, there really isn't a contest there, and that a subjective decision is being made to bring in both sides on things that we shouldn't have to bring in both sides. We actually shouldn't have to prove up. And I'll just mention one other example. We spent years, others spent years researching how the children of LGBTQ parents came out. There was definitely both sides of research presented on that. That's not actually how we get to decide. That's not actually how we decide who gets to parent in this country. Your right to parent really isn't based on like general research about parenting of people of your type overall. There's a lot of different groups I could define in different ways that would fail that research test. We don't do it that way here. But we played along, we did the research, we proved up. I at least think for a while, in 2014 to 16, we kind of proved up enough. It's back in contestation again. But again, there are kind of normative, values-laden decisions made before someone, including journalists, go out and seek both sides. And going back to Kathy briefly, to your point, we were founded because a number of assertions and claims were being made about the community that were common knowledge and that no one needed both sides on at that point. You could file a case for marriage equality, go into court, and someone could say there aren't any same-sex couples, their relationships don't last, they don't have kids, they don't rely on each other members of different sex couples. Those are the arguments in the Massachusetts Goodrich case. I should shut up. Those are the arguments in the Goodrich case. But that was enough. That was common knowledge. And so really our role at the beginning was to start taking that apart. And I'll get to this a little bit later. The myth making had occurred from opponents of LGBT rights and proponents as well. And I think that's one important thing in this discussion to bring about, is that if we're gonna follow research, it does require some faith to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, Brad. Shelby?
Yeah, I have a lot to say, and I feel like I just had a whole PhD in understanding your world of things, so thank you. Before I start, I think it's important to contextualize trans movement in this more broadly, and this is not a philanthropic space, but so you all know, like 25 cents of every $100 of LGBT philanthropy goes to trans groups. So I say that partly to contextualize that TLC and where we sit is sort of a unique space, and we've had I think a large responsibility to trans community across the country and really to some extent globally right now in that. You know, despite all of the odds, I think we have to just say that we as a movement, and we as trans movement specifically, we're winning, despite not having the funding and all of these things. But I think a number that I've thrown out there recently that is helpful to sort of, for folks to understand the severity of the issues that we're dealing with. If you combine the top 3 LGBT orgs, so that isn't TLC included, nor the task force, their budgets total about $250 million annually. Now, the Christian nationalist movement in 2020 spent over $310 million researching anti-trans legislation. So I think to Erin's point, it's like there isn't a level playing field, but even said that, some of our more recent messaging research with ASO Communications and Lake Research Partners said that 6 of 10 people polled said trans people deserve to be themselves. So we have the public support. And you know, this is like anecdotally from me. I am around the country talking to people day in and day out about trans rights, and you know, you can tell them and they'll agree, like most Americans are supportive of trans people, but you ask them then the follow-up question, could you sit at the kitchen table with your aunts, your uncles, your cousins, and have a conversation about trans kids playing sports or healthcare? They say no. And that's not that they don't support it, it's that they need the research and the talking points on how to do that. And you know, I think that's why getting that information is so critical. But I do think it's why we've had a lot of success in leaning into our race, class, gender narrative work, because the more information we can get out there and talk to people about how they're experiencing this, what message is going to work, the better equipped every single one of us is to have really the kitchen table conversations, which I think lead to the like broader sort of conversations that we are having. That said, I think, you know, let's also highlight the huge wins that we have had. I mean, some of my colleagues yesterday were on a panel and beautifully highlighted that this year alone, we had over 600 anti-LGBT bills in legislatures. And like under 25 of them passed. Like that's pretty remarkable given the lack of resource, the sheer numbers that we just don't have compared to our opposition, that we're defeating these things. And I think it's almost imperative then to highlight those wins and the communities that are literally working in coalitions across tables, across aisles, to think, how do we start to move the needle on this conversation? Because we are winning, and we're not highlighting those stories. You know, I've spent the last 20 years working in LGBT movement, a lot of it in the anti-violence movement. And you know, for a long time, we had to push to get people to not talk about trans people as like only the victims. And you know, look at the history of sort of how we're portrayed in media. You all know this. But how do we start to share the stories of resilience and the ways that, you know, trans people aren't just like trans people existing. We're literally in every fraction of society doing the things that need to get done to move the needle on the conversation and just frankly normalize trans people's existence. Because as much as I think the Christian nationalist movement, the MAGA Republicans, want to highlight that we're some special anomaly, we're not. We're just kind of everyday people. And particularly the young kids right now who are just literally saying, hey, adults, like follow our lead. We have the answers. Putting them at the center of the conversation versus a bunch of adults, you know, and even that respect versus protect narrative. I think as a movement, we need to move away from this idea that we have to protect young kids, but instead we need to protect young people who are leading the movement, who are making clear demands of what it is that they want finding ways to exist even despite some of these states saying we're not going to allow you to have health care, we're not going to allow you to have IDs that match your gender, all these things, they're still doing it. So I think that that is, to me, really clear that we are winning despite all of these odds and it not being a level playing field.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, hold on to the mic, Shobi. I mean, I think that's one of the most powerful things that can happen at this convention is that we can come together and actually directly have these conversations. And you have, I don't think they lock the doors, but you kind of have a captive audience. What are some ways that journalists can do that? What are some resources that they have that we can provide? I mean, I know that it was when we were in Philly a few years ago, I think, I just kind of suggested to Gender Cool that they come to the conference, and we had one of their trans champions on a plenary and the next year. And out of that came a ton of coverage. And the message from, and the success of the coverage was awesome. People ended up on the, GLAAD Award stage, et cetera. And it got a ton of visibility. But the message that really came through from these young people was stop talking about us and start talking to us. And so, I think for this room, some ideas, suggestions, ways that they can not just do the narrative change, but actually access, because that's often the challenge, is actually accessing the folks who are willing to and able to tell their stories, especially in this climate, which is, can be challenging. So if you want to, can you start that off?
Yeah, I can start it off, and I'll do a plug because my communications director would not let me leave if I didn't. So they're on your tables.
She asked me to ask that question.
Here's some great journalist guides. We have a number of them, and if you can't access the ones that you want, we have more on our website. But we have one on the table, Guide to Reporting on Anti-Trans Violence, which is just a really great guide. And then also the language guide for journalists and communities around abortion and reproductive care. Understanding that our communities are not a monolith and that we need to be thinking about bodily autonomy more broadly. But to the youth point, and I think for us, it's sort of how we've gotten to this moment. So about 12 years ago, we felt it was imperative to start doing work with youth-specific organizations. So we've had a long-term partnership with the GSA Network and their Gender Justice Leadership Project. And they have their Truth Project, which is the Trans Youth Project. And each year they convene, 10 to 20 trans youth around the country who are learning how to do storytelling and to be telling their own stories. So I think that is a great way to think about that. Certainly, I think right now, too, there's just a ton of the ways that, young people are subject to a lot of these heinous laws and bills, but also, despite all of that, are showing that resistance. So I think in that moment, it'd be important to highlight those organizations, but particularly young people who are in a position to be speaking out on these issues. And then I'd say the other thing is think about the ways that there are almost, at this point, a trans org in every state. 10 years ago, that was not the case. Now I think we're living in a moment where there is an organization almost in every state. So as much as I think you can do a quick Google search and find the statistics that are coming from some of the national, big hitter centers, yes, that's important. But there's also the groups on the ground that you could build relationships with and start telling those stories, which include trans youth voices.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump in here too. I think another thing that we need to do as journalists is defend the platforms that the young people are speaking on. So we have seen bans on TikTok in several states, for instance. We are currently seeing pushes from the same groups that are passing the anti-trans and anti-queer laws to ban youth from social media, period, to make it to where you have to be 18 to even access any social media. And it is, in my opinion, from following the rhetoric of these groups, from seeing the same actors pass these bans, that they are doing so because they see the impact that youth voices are having, not just on LGBTQ issues, but on a broad variety of issues. And so I think that we need to be able to defend those platforms and their ability to access them.
Do you want to add anything, Kira? No.
Oh, it's on? Okay, great. I have a
We
couple
don't mute the mics like in the debate.
I'm
You can
loud,
go ahead. Yeah.
loud Missourian. I have a couple thoughts just kind of on I think, first of all, how to cover research, which I think is important, and then a couple of stories that I think are really important to cover. And so, not all research is the same, as you know. Not all researchers are the same, and it takes a little bit more work and effort to really dig into who folks are and the quality of their research. But I think that's so incredibly important right now. One of the main differences I see from today versus 20 years ago is the sophistication of which the anti-LGBT rights groups are funding, promoting, obfuscating kind of research out there to create things that look and sound like research at first blush, but really are not. And so examining whether, how stuff was published, whether it was peer reviewed, they tend to trot out the same researchers over and over again in different forums in different states, making sure you understand their history. I mean, doing pieces on these folks who are repeatedly in state legislatures, they're appearing before courts, they're in the media, they're doing the op-eds, like they're the same people, but really knowing that and paying attention and paying careful attention. And I think what we also then have to be open to is that research that comes out of the Williams Institute, academic research that is supporting LGBT rights, LGBT organizations are also held to the same standard. So I think it's a call for a return in belief of research done well, of disclosures of any bias, of any sort of financial support that really means all research and researchers need to be held accountable, which is difficult to do when I know budgets for media are being slashed. It's that takes some time and effort, but there are organizations and groups helping to gather that information. And then just two stories that I think are really important right now. One is this way that we're deprived of data is maybe not the sexiest story out there, but it is limiting almost everything that we do. I'll give two quick examples. We produce these estimates of how many LGBTQ people there are, adults, youth, cis, trans. Can't tell you how much work it takes to create those estimates because the best data sources out there actually don't provide enough information to provide state level estimates for every state or to break down by age, race, gender, other things we'd like to break down to get, all of you and policymakers accurate state information. We're spending hours and hours of work and hundreds of thousands of dollars to create something that the government survey should be giving us directly. The current population survey, the survey for income and program participation, this is how we know about unemployment. This is how we know about poverty. This is how we know about access to support programs from the government. We're not in it. I don't know what the Department of Labor is doing. I'm very good friends with Julie Sue. I think she's amazing, and they need to move. Like, we need this data. We needed it, decades ago. These are important stories where our community, our movement, things like organizations like the Williams Institute are helping to fill in some of this data, but it is not the same. It is a time-consuming and expensive task, and it's a real inequality for our community. And then I'm going to pause there, but at some point I'd like to come back and talk about the attack on not only researcher, but LGBTQ, but research done by people who are doing research that supports LGBTQ issues.
Sure.
I think there are three interventions that could be really powerful. It could just be tithing some of your time too, right? Like, who goes to church? Y'all know about tithing? Okay, yeah, but this is a different kind. But the fights around freedom of speech and where that gets upheld and where it gets twisted and not. So I think pulling the curtain back on that and punctuating where freedom of speech is like, oh, we've got to protect hate speech because it's freedom of speech, but we can't protect young people who are trying to navigate identity in their schools. Huh? call BS on that, right? Like, where are those places? And also fighting, right, to fortify freedom of speech. The right to engage in the political process, and in particular, the right to vote. That sounds so tangential, except being our people, and when I say our people, I should say our peoples, because there are multiple attacks in trying to target and carve out access to the political system to the very people that we represent, talk about, are trying to win rights and equity for. So that right to vote piece, like the right to engage and actually exercise personal and community power, is critical for now, but also for the future of how we advocate for ourselves in our communities. And then finally, there are literally our opposition forces are actually targeting our ability to even collect data. Mm-hmm. So not only is it not, right, do we not have it, they're saying it's actually illegal for you to even ask questions and collect data in some places, spaces around the country, right? And it's collection around data and demographics. In Texas, there's been, even being able to report harassment connected to queerness, right, or race. So tithing to fighting, right, or again, pulling the curtain back on the fact that they are literally targeting our ability to even ask questions and collect data about our people is critical, right? Both, because your jobs depend on real data, but also, right, we know, and our opposition knows, that there's power in information. Mm. It's not an accident that they're trying to curb our ability to access it and collect it. And so it's that critical.
I actually want to jump in here because you said a few things, and I want to give a couple examples that highlight exactly what you just said so that people can really understand this. So for the research thing, did you know that in all 25 states where gender-affirming care has been banned, and I tracked all of the hearings, I tracked all of the amendments as this was happening, every single state, Democrats tried to put forward an amendment guaranteeing a research exemption, saying, okay, if you think that the care is experimental, you think that the care doesn't work, allow it to be done under research circumstances with our local health university, for instance. Those amendments were universally defeated in every single state because it's not about not enough research, it's about they don't want there to be the research that supports our cause. Whenever it comes to voting, we are currently seeing trans people potentially be turned away at the polls because their gender marker doesn't match with new voter ID laws. And this is becoming a major issue right now. Trans and non-binary people make up, depending on the source of information, up to like 3% of people. So if you look at Texas right now, you might have issues around that. And whenever it comes to free speech, we see teachers right now. All of the laws that are currently being put into place right now where a teacher has to have parental permission to use a trans person's pronoun or use a trans person's chosen name. So right now, these laws say that it's a matter of freedom of speech if you are a teacher and you are religiously opposed to gendering a trans person correctly. That is a matter of freedom of speech. You can say, I don't want to gender you correctly. However, if you're a teacher who says, I do want to gender you correctly, right, no longer is it freedom of speech, it now becomes a parental rights issue.
Right.
That's because it is not freedom of speech. That's not the base level here. It's all about whatever opposes trans people and queer people in the classroom. And so everything you just said was spot on.
Yep. Or twisted, as Kira would say. So you've all brought up something that has been looming this entire convention, which is the election and politics and what the government has been doing or not doing. The task force has had campaigns, Queer the Census, right? Queer the Vote, working to make sure that we're included, that our voices are heard. But can you each talk a little bit about what you see, moving forward? Depending on the outcomes of the election, I think it's pretty, stark and obvious, depending on which direction it goes. But what we should be seeing, what we want to be seeing, what our community should be advocating for, and what are the stories that journalists can be telling as we very quickly approach the election that can help highlight some of these issues and challenges?
So I've been covering LGBTQ issues in elections for a while now. And I think that one of the assumptions that people make, be they journalists or be they people who are advising people politically, is that trans issues, LGBTQ issues, queer issues are harmful to left-leaning candidates, for instance, or to the Democratic Party, for instance, et cetera. What I can tell you is that universally, this has not been the case. They have run on anti-trans platforms in several states, and it always seems to fail. I can literally list off hundreds of examples, but in Georgia, in 2022, the closing week of the election, Herschel Walker sat down with the anti-trans swimmer Riley Gaines and did this big 1-minute ad. They spent tons of money on it, and Herschel Walker lost. In Arizona, Kari Lake basically ran an ad campaign against Governor Hobbs, saying that her husband was a therapist that affirmed trans youth. She lost. We saw this in Michigan, where the Democrats took a trifecta in the Michigan House, and the GOP chair said at the end that the reason why they lost, and this is a quote, in Michigan, is because they spent more money on ads attacking trans people than they did on bread and butter issues like the economy and more. In Wisconsin, Judge Janet Protasiewicz, they spent $3 million on anti-trans ads. They had this one ad of like the scissors floating on on a TV screen saying she's going to approve sex change surgeries for kids. She won by 10 points. This continues. In 2023, Moms for Liberty lost 70% of their elections across the United States. And just a couple of weeks ago, we saw Governor Ron DeSantis-backed school board candidates across Florida get wiped. This issue is not one that we have historically seen as one that actually works for the people that are trying to exploit it for political gain. And then whenever you look at the polls, I think that there's a misunderstanding on what the polls actually say. So for instance, there are a lot of polls that give you a lot of different answers for what the general public think about trans people. You'll see, for instance, depending on how it's worded, the majority of the general public opposes sex change surgeries for minors, but then if you word it like gender-affirming care, suddenly people support. The Gallup poll just showed one that supports. There is one poll finding that is not changed, and that has never changed since the beginning of this. And that is that most people, the vast majority of people, like 80% of people, when asked if they view this as a political distraction, say yes. They rank it as their lowest of the lowest issues. And so whenever we see, looking forward, the campaigns that we're going to see over the next few months, we are going to continue to watch them use this, them try to use this as a major issue. And what I am looking for, what I'm watching in this election, is that this is, I think, going to make or break the sort of anti-trans right and their methods that they're using right now. Because right now, they just dropped an $80 million ad spend in Michigan, the Senate Leadership Fund. And two of their first 3 ads are attacking trans people. And so whenever I see this, if they fail this time, I think people are going to start to question the use of this tactic. And that's what I'm watching right now.
Hope so.
Can I add one point to that really quick? Which I think the other thing to watch for is Republicans who in the primary ran on anti-trans rhetoric and then they drop it, because I think some of them do know. So if you're covering elections and you've seen people who in the primary went hard against the trans community and then suddenly they don't want to talk about that, I think they understand the data that Aaron just talked about.
Nice. Kira? That's what
So juicy. There is, I don't know, we have this disease that we think everything's going to change with a presidential election. Like, it's going to be like night and day, right? Like the day after an election, everything's going to be different. And no, not y'all, but I'm saying the peoples, right? Like our peoples. One of the things that through our both C3 and C4 vote work that we're really intentional about is reminding people that regardless of what happens on election day, the targeting of queer and trans people is likely to ramp up. whether we win or lose, the actual lived realities of our people, the violence, the harassment, the targeting, right? Like the what comes out in terms of punitive legislation at the state level is likely to ramp up, either because they're going to be celebrating or they're going to be really mad. So reminding people, like, that is. It's a delicate dance, right? Because we want to keep people excited about being engaged in the political, right, system, right, and inspired, but also to understand that accountability is what happens the day after the election, right? Like, we can celebrate, but then what does it look like to hold electeds across parties, hold them accountable to what our communities are saying they need, they want, and deserve. And so I don't know, there was this meme going around that I loved, if anyone knows who it belongs to, but a vote is not a Valentine, but it's a chess move. Probably a lot. Did you all see that? It was so, no? Who's seen that? No? What? Wow, algorithms are real. Well, anyway, it was this really powerful statement. Like, this was before Kamala and Biden like remixed everything, but we were really trying to people were not excited, right? Like, people were thinking about voting like they think about taking out the trash, right? It's like, I don't want to, but I have to, or it's gonna stink in here, right? Like, it was kind of, that's how their approach to voting was. And this meme came out that was like, a vote is not a Valentine, it's a chess move. And I think as we're talking about political engagement, right? How do we stay true to the fact that what people are experiencing at the hands of the state, right? The violence, the harassment, the invisibility is real. And while they may not have any reason to trust, right, that government is gonna have their back, the only way to change that is for them to be engaged, right? The only way that's gonna change is if they see people like them, right, in the work, whether that, again, is telling the truth in the news, in social media, in advocacy. They've got to see us doing it, right, to then be engaged in it. And so I think that's how do we think about engagement of our people through the election, right? Like, the election isn't the end. How do we keep the work and the inspiration and the enticement into being a part of the process alive through Election Day?
I think I'm probably thinking the same things that everyone in this room is thinking, that we have one or two directions we can head, and one is pretty catastrophic, and one, I think, to me, I'm thinking, how do we start to push for the world we want to be living in? Because I do think there's going to be violence and extremism either way, but I do think that we have an opportunity if we can get certain people in office that care about the same values that we have. And I do think that we're kind of at this interesting moment where I think young people have said, like, we're living in a time where you have to make this work intersectional. You've seen it on college campuses with young people standing up against the war against Palestine. You've seen it with trans youth standing up and testifying in courthouses as 9 and 10-year-olds whose parents are facing, being investigated by Child Protective Services for protecting their trans kid. And I will say this, for me, I spent my 20s and 30s living in coastal major cities, and now I'm not. And the MAGA Republicans are alive and well, and we have to, I think, as progressive movements, start understanding how we talk as intersectional as they do. Because, I watched the DNC probably like many here, and was like, I had like a DNC hangover for a week. Did they talk about trans people? No. Did the Republicans? Without a doubt. In this way that was like dehumanizing.
Every 5 minutes.
So
yeah.
how do we actually start to organize ourselves in a little bit better way to understand that climate justice is connected to trans rights, is connected to reproductive freedom, is connected to, all of these things. And I think for us, it's kind of how we've been approaching it is the work that we've done in launching. We have a newer program called the Trans Agenda for Liberation Narrative Lab. And we did it out of a real demand for the need for something like that to exist. For the last decade, groups have been fighting bills in state legislatures that are just increasingly alarming in how they're approaching it. I mean, you were lifting up Texas. I mean, Texas, like in the last week, has just decided low-key that they're going to keep trans people from changing their gender marker and now birth certificates. Oh, I don't know, 2 months before the election. That's not a surprise. Right. But what I do think is that groups on the ground said repeatedly, we need access and training on how to do press releases, on how to talk about these issues when they're rapidly changing, frankly, on how to interpret bills and laws and what this actually means, and not from a legal perspective, from a I'm a person, this is going to impact my community, how do I communicate that to them? Right. And then the broader narrative strategy, which is how do we talk about these issues overlapping? Whether it's an economic justice issue, whether it's a racial justice issue, whether it's a climate justice issue, all of those things. I think back to what you're saying. And I think it's, for a while, we sat around waiting for somebody else to do it for us. And I think at a certain point, it's we we have the resource, the expertise, the messaging research. So let's start to work in a more unified way across the country. So through our narrative lab, we have fellows and hubs across the country that are working together to be trained up on messaging, to be trained up on narrative, but also naming the fact that what's going to work in Ohio for messaging isn't going to work in Montana, isn't going to work in Texas, is different than what's going to work in California. So knowing that we have to have a broad swath of how we talk about these things to change sort of hearts and minds in a bigger way is going to be key in the months and years ahead. But I'll close with this. So a couple months ago, I sat in a sort of election scenario, fascism is on the rise was the topic of the conversation. And all of these national groups started panicking and being we need to do scenario planning for the election. And finally, some of the groups that were in the Deep South said, what is scenario planning? And the nationals groups looked horrified. They were well, how do these Southern folks not know what we're talking about? And at the end of the day, they said pretty eloquently, we've been living in the MAGA Republican, we've been living in the MAGA Republican world for decades, and our communities are resisting. We are finding ways to thrive, and we are finding ways to care for each other, and we're telling the stories that need to be told. We just need actual people to get them out to the broader world so they understand what we're doing as a community. So I think regardless of that, of whatever election outcome, people are going to find ways to survive and thrive. But I do think we have something that's pretty consequential for all of us, which is we're headed to the Supreme Court for trans rights. And I think it is the moment where our communities, our work, our reporting might be divided and have different approaches. If we do not find a unified voice to start talking about what is on the line with this and lift up the very people, trans youth, who are the most impacted and centered to this, we might as well just all quit our jobs and go to the beach. Because I think it is that imperative that we get behind this. We figure out a way that we have a path forward. The litigators know what they're doing. They're going to litigate. But we need to have unified messaging on our end.
Can you actually name the case and just talk about it for a minute? Thank you.
It is Saturday morning, and I have not slept great. It's Scrimeti versus United States. Thank you. And it's going to the Supreme Court.
Them.
It's going to the Supreme Court, and it will determine the future of trans youth receiving health care.
Yeah.
So that the decision on that would be final probably by June of next year. So I think an ask to you all is, if you're covering these issues, cover this. There's going to be a lot of work around it. There's going to be a lot of organizing, and there's going to be a lot of time in the courts, and we need to talk about it and get our stories out there.
There's also planning already going on. I could do a plug for the National Comms group that meets every week on Zoom, right? in terms of putting together resources for journalists, individuals they can talk to, connecting with the litigators, and then there will be closer to the hearing, like rallies and events that we'll be doing. So if you are interested in that, come talk to one of us up here, and we're happy to put you on our list to make sure you get that information. I love that I don't really after the first couple questions, I don't really make more because they take care of it. So thank you, Kiera and Shelby, for prompting I'll make it the last question, and then I want to open it up to the audience because there are lots of you here, and nobody left, which is always a really good sign.
They locked the door.
That was, they locked the door. Yeah, that was a little burn on, anyway. This brings up something that I know I think about a lot, and I think is something really important to bring up to this audience, which is how do we do the work within our own communities, whether that's within progressive spaces, across issues, or whether that's within the queer community where we are still dealing with, we're still dealing with transphobia. We're still dealing with, folks in the community who are not coming forward to help prioritize this in the way we have other things. How does that work happen in the context of what you all do?
So I think that to piggyback off of what you had said earlier is that a lot of these issues are interconnected, especially whenever it comes to, say, abortion rights and bodily autonomy. And in fact, one of the positive bills, the positive pieces of protective legislation that I have seen over the last 2 years were the safe state laws, the refugee laws, the shield laws. They're called different things depending on which state. And what this says is that if you are a transgender person fleeing a state like Texas or Alabama or Tennessee, and you get your care in Washington State or Colorado or Michigan or Wisconsin, those last two I actually don't think passed the laws, but if you flee your state to one of these states that is deemed a safe state, that your home government, that the place that you came from, can't come in and subpoena your medical records, can't come in and try to charge you with a crime. And why is this important? Well, we actually are seeing that there are now arguments, especially by Attorney General Ken Paxton out of Texas, that if you are seeking an abortion out of your state line, he can get your medical records and potentially charge people that helped you get out of the state with violating Texas laws. These same laws were also targeted towards trans people. And in fact, just this year in Tennessee, we saw a bill that says that you can't aid or abet youth traveling across state lines to get an abortion. And then a second law was passed that says you can't aid or abet youth traveling across state lines to get gender-affirming care. And obviously, we all know about the Idaho bill that says that you can't travel across state lines you can't take a youth across state lines to get an abortion. And so what happened was that the abortion rights advocates and the transgender rights advocates all realized, hey, they're targeting us in the same way with the same kind of laws. And in fact, if we try to go ahead and join our forces together, we can get some protections in our state that are going to protect everybody moving forward. And so we had 17 states pass these laws that protect not just trans people, but also abortion providers and abortion patients. And this is already protected patients because Attorney General Ken Paxton has already subpoenaed Seattle Children's Hospital in Washington State for the medical records of all the trans youth that left and went to Washington State. And the law worked. It stopped them from having to hand over their medical records. These fights are so interconnected. In fact, we saw in Idaho, they were targeting transgender people, and they used the exact same rhetoric. And there was actually a Republican representative who said, Representative Julianne Young out of Idaho, that said, I see this as the same fight. It's not about the life of the child, but the potential to give life to a new generation. And so they see it this way. And I think that we have to see where these connections overlap as well and build them.
An offering I have is a concept called principled struggle. It is growing in terms of popularity, students, right, of the frame. Principled struggle. We all love the Googles. Check it out. A few years ago, I was really grappling, trying to make sense of Black Trumpers, right? Or Latino Proud Boys, or anti-trans feminists, or queer anti-abortionists. We have a disease right now of righteousness and purity. Righteousness and purity. If you don't agree with me 100%, we are now enemies. We are now opposition, and there is no room for you in this space. We are going to righteous ourselves out of winning. Principled struggle, the core of it is about how do I disagree with you and stay in community with you? How do I disagree with you and stay in community with you? How are we engaging 70-year-old Black grandma who loves their grandchild but doesn't understand trans stuff? Can we create space for her? Or are we gonna righteous her out of community, even though she's an ally? How many of you have perpetuated racism? How many of you have perpetuated sexism, homophobia, transphobia? Our hand should go up every single time, because none of us have escaped what racism, homophobia, transphobia, right? Y'all, you can't escape it. We have convinced ourselves that we have somehow got to get out of bigotry card because we are self-defined progressives. You have work to do. I have work to do. Guess what? I've actually perpetuated anti-Black racism, y'all. I'll tell you how. Black folks, including myself, feel like we have to work harder, 2 times, 3 times harder. You know what the problem with that is? I am now judging Black staff about whether or not they're working 2 or 3 times harder, right? If you're not actually doing more than your white counterpart, I'm like, you're not working hard enough. If we can identify that in ourselves, if we can agree that each of us needs grace, then we've got to be willing to offer it beyond. Our communities are not pure. Like, let's think about our own Thanksgiving tables. Y'all, some of the things my grandma has said, ooh. I have an uncle that voted for Trump. But that's not new. That's not new. Our families, right, our communities are not a monolith. So then how do we engage, right, meet people where they're at, give them a space to come in, and then take them on a journey with us? If you've got a young Black man who's with us on 52% of the things, but not on the rest, and progressive folks don't say you don't have a seat at this table, guess what? He's gonna find a seat at another table. He's gonna find a seat, because that's a human thing. We need to belong. So who opened the door for him after we closed the door on him? We've got to stop thinking about states and people and community as a monolith. We are evolving every damn day. And it's an opportunity for us to bring people into community with us, into advocacy with us, into principled struggle with us.
Reverend Kiera Johnson.
I'm from Georgia, I can preach, child.
I have a couple of points, and I'm not a reverend yet. So, I think to kind of build off what Kiera's saying, I think as progressive movements, we spend a lot of time capitulating and talking about the right. But I think what we need to understand is that the right and like the MAGA Republicans at this point are spending a lot of times talking to bases and building a base. And I think we have a real opportunity right now to start as a movement, and that includes all of us in this room, regardless of the aisles that we're sitting in and lanes that we're in, to start telling the stories that our communities deserve. And I'll leave you with a highlight, because this is a story that always makes me happy. It was 2017, the Texas legislature had one of their first big anti-trans bills. We had been down there for a couple months sort of helping folks on the ground, and we defeated that bill, and we were at a celebratory LGBT pool party at a hotel. And this little trans girl comes up to me, and she saw my name tag, and it said TLC, and she goes, "Oh, you work for TLC?" And I was like, "Oh my God, it's so cute, this little trans kid, she knows who I am. And she knows about TLC." And I was like, "Yeah, I help trans people like you and me." And she literally looked at me, she was like, "Oh, never mind, I thought you worked for the Dinosaur Channel." And, this 9-year-old kid who lived in Texas, who had a supportive family, and had, spent a month in the Texas legislature, which if there's anyone from Texas, you know what the Texas legislature is like. It's its own country, deep burrowed and underground, and there's extremists yelling at you, and even the Democrats don't even want to really support you. So it's very overwhelming. But this young kid who's now probably in high school, just knew enough about joy that she literally didn't need to be bothered with trans issues, because she was affirmed, protected, and actually had a family and community around her that was fighting for her. So I think to me, that's the world that we all need to be working towards right now.
It's great. I think I'll just wrap up with two examples that give me a lot of hope, and then I think two challenges. Although maybe I should do that in reverse order. But let me start with the hope, and I think this just reinforces the idea that our rights, our movement, is not dependent solely on who's president or who's in the Supreme Court. And I think what's exciting about this election is I believe we're now up to 10 states who are going to vote on reproductive justice in terms of enshrining it in their state constitutions, which I think is something that was just kind of unforeseeable in, just 2 years ago when the Dobbs decision was decided. There's every reason to think, like they have passed so far in every state, that they will continue to pass, which means that starting here in Los Angeles, you could get in a car and drive all the way to Indiana and be in a state with state constitutional protections for reproductive justice, many of those states going beyond what Roe versus Wade protected. I think that's an extraordinary achievement. It's achievement by people saying this is our Constitution, we get to decide what it means. It is up to us. It's not up to these 9 folks who are on the Supreme Court. I work probably the most closely connecting our research with actually kind of policy efforts on HIV criminalization. And a lot of this work has occurred in the South, it's occurred in red states, and it's been successful. And it's about taking a highly stigmatized issue in which people are very unaware, I was going to say ignorant, but unaware, maybe ignorant, and still think that you can get HIV from touching, spitting, scratching, biting, whatever, sitting down with folks, walking through the research, working with a big coalition of people, because even though these laws started as kind of anti-LGBT laws, their effect today is to add sentences on to people of color who are already enmeshed in the criminal system. That's their only purpose. Not their only purpose. That is their overwhelming primary purpose today. So it takes a coalition of people working in the states, but we've been successful in Georgia. We've been successful in Missouri, successful in North Carolina, successful in Virginia. So there's some faith still in there in research. And there's work that we can do no matter what's going on more broadly. And then 2 challenges. It was cute when Kellyanne Conway said alternative facts, and it was kind of, it's funny. But we're in a real crisis here on an attack on data and research. And I think the takedown of Claudine Gay is about the most serious thing that's impacted my world in the last couple of years. And that was a takedown that was organized, as they'll tell you on the right, with money, with media, and to go after DEI issues in general. But it was the assumption of a bias because of who someone is, a takedown in the research that was not valid, that was not accurate, that almost any academic article would not withstand. But it was a discrediting at the very top of our academic institutions of research and researchers. And there are about a dozen states that have passed laws, anti-DEI laws, and that type of work is being done intensely in states in the Midwest and South, taking out LGBTQ research and researchers, and we all need to take pause in that. And I guess I'll just end, which I think it sounds like the Michael, who donated the money for this panel, was a big priority in his, is I think we still spend too little time talking about religion and faith. This is an important part of so many people in our community's worlds. It's such an important place to find connection. And I think really trying to bust this idea that there are opponents, there are people of faith who oppose LGBT rights, and people who are LGBT who are not people of faith, continuing to break down that down and have those conversations is critical to our path forward.
Thank you. So, y'all going to have to do that again when we finish, but we're going to go to questions. I will do a very quick moment, because when I jump out here, I used to always say I get to do Phil Donahue, and I just want to take one moment to remember a man who was one of our greatest allies, Phil Donahue. I love me some Phil Donahue. Don't make me cry. He was amazing. So we'll start here, and if you've got a question, raise your hand, and we'll come around.
Hello. I am thinking about the additional fight in tandem with legal issues for direct pressure on medical institutions that I think is not being discussed. I am from Nashville, Tennessee, and receive gender-affirming care at Vanderbilt UMC, which in 2023 released essentially without qualm trans medical records to the Tennessee Attorney General. I gut dropped when I saw that because I'm not out to my family. That could have put me essentially on, a list that they're pretty clearly trying to compile of people that they're targeting. I was lucky that I'm privileged enough that I'm not on TennCare, their state healthcare program, and that was the explicit target of that inquiry. So, all that in mind, what can we do about these medical institutions? Because certainly they're subject to law, logically, but what does pressure look like on these spaces that are enacting this research that we want to protect, that are obviously providing the direct care themselves? How can we, use our positions to pressure them and hopefully prevent things like that from happening again?
That is an excellent question. Let me give everybody some context on this so that everybody is fully aware of what's going on here. That didn't just happen with Vanderbilt in Tennessee. We are seeing the targeting of adult trans healthcare in several states at university-sponsored hospitals. So for instance, we've seen this in South Carolina, and I'm getting emails right now from trans adults in Florida who are saying that all of the Florida university hospital systems are no longer providing them care. They're being cut off. I want to highlight that there was no law that said that they can't provide care. There was no law that said that Vanderbilt had to give up all the trans people's medical records. There's no law that says that Texas hospitals are doing the same thing. But what's happening is we are seeing legislators go behind the scenes and talk to the hospital presidents and say, hey, you're either gonna do this or we're gonna pull your education funding next year. And they have threatened these sort of just package pull funding, and we have then seen the university president say, okay, well then we're just gonna stop providing trans health care. It doesn't only stop at that though. We are currently seeing the same thing with DEI efforts in universities, where the presidents of the colleges are either being changed out to ones that are gonna end DEI, or they're being told, hey, you better stop the DEI stuff. Even though we don't have the votes to pass an anti-DEI bill, we do have the votes to perhaps lessen your funding. And so we are seeing this time and time again across the United States right now. And there's very little reporting on this. There's not a lot of reporting on, like, whenever it happens, it takes the community by surprise often because nobody is touching it. Nobody is talking to the people who are making this actually happen right now. And this is leaving trans people with the worry that even if we are in areas where there is no law against us, that all of a sudden our healthcare could be pulled out from under us because of a process that is not even a genuine legislative process. It's something that's done behind the scenes. And so I do think that we need to collectively better, as journalists, report on this more in the early stages so that once it happens, it doesn't just surprise everybody.
Anybody else? We're good. We say that a lot with Aaron.
I cover local politics in San Diego, and that involves a lot of housing policy. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how our blue cities and blue states are often the most resistant to making more space for us in our, even in our historically queer communities. And I see a lot of queer elders kind of pulling the ladder up from behind them, saying like, no, we don't want more people living in our neighborhood because we like it the way it is. And I'm wondering if, California just lost electoral votes to Texas. We're exporting our poor people because it's more affordable to live there. And I'm wondering if this issue of housing affordability and more broadly the right to mobility, the right to flee those states where our rights are under attack, is at all on the agenda or the radar of our national organizations?
I can start, and I'm sure others have a lot to say. I mean, I think it has to be, and I think, kind of actually building off the first question is like we're also dealing with the reality that it is great that some of these laws or states are putting shield laws in place, but what it's not accounting for is the sheer cost to travel out of state for continuous health care. I think for a while we thought, well, maybe we can model it after the abortion model, which is like the $500 to $1,000 one-offs for people to go out of state and then return home. But if you're looking at providing your health care out of state for a year, I mean, I'm here to tell you it's not cheap. And we have to think about the cost. And I also think it's incredibly classed, the ways that it's sort of like this narrative of like, my family is fleeing to, one of these safer places. It's like, well, are you fleeing to the Bay Area where, anyone that lives in the Bay Area, you can't afford to live there at this point. And I think it becomes an affordability issue as you're looking at sort of just like the deeper economic impacts, particularly in a COVID, sort of post-COVID, whatever that means, world, where the rents in these cities has just gone astronomically high. And not to mention that it's not even like social services are readily available to communities coming in because they're so overburdened with what they already do have. I'll use, it's not a California, but it's the other emerging California, which is New Mexico. So New Mexico is a state that has some of the more advanced protections for trans people in that region. And people are increasingly going there to seek health care out of state or relocate there if they could. But what people aren't taking into account is that the state of New Mexico is incredibly impoverished as a whole. Like, its governor comes out of the public health sector. She put extreme measures in place, I think, to ensure that her residents did not die of COVID, because COVID rates, they literally could not afford it. But there is 2 trans-specific surgeons and medical providers in the state of New Mexico, one of whom is actually being investigated for malpractice. So that leaves 1 doctor for a state that already has a large population of trans people, but then people coming in out of state. So I think the waits are becoming absorbent for folks. And I think to some extent, people living in these major cities, we have to start thinking about what does it mean to think about affordability in a broader scale. And the one group, and this is a little tangential, but years ago, there was an organization in New York called Queers for Economic Justice. And it was queer elders that started this organization and said, like, we're not talking about poverty in our communities. And I think to Brad's point and to what others have lifted up, we don't actually know the extreme poverty that many of our communities are living in because we don't have the data for it, but poverty is like the #1 driver of criminalization on all levels that our communities are facing. So if we don't start to prioritize the broader economic justice framework and not just the like public benefits, but in a like, how are we making our world more affordable for all people, but that includes queer people, trans people, poor people writ large, then we're going to keep facing the same things we're facing. So I think what you raise is a great question. I hope you're reporting on it, and I imagine you are, and now I'm going to follow your stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything Shelby said, and I'll just add in, I just finished up a study for the County of Los Angeles, which is called Communities of Resilience. It's on our webpage if you want to check it out. But it was basically a needs assessment of the LGBT community for all of LA County, which is like 10 million people. But the number 1 issue that came up for everyone was affordability, the high cost of living. It is, yes, there are problems with discrimination, there are problems with safety, but LGBTQ people in LA County have double the rates of poverty, they have higher rates of being rent overburdened, severely overburdened, double the rates of being unhoused, higher rates of food insecurity, on every sort of measure of being able to live here, which is a very expensive place to live. There were huge disparities. And when we asked folks, what do you most want to tell elected officials, it was not about LGBT rights, it was about how do we afford to live here. And so that means a lot in terms of LA, which has served as this promise for LGBTQ people, a place to come, a haven. Youth get off here at the bus stop, every day to come here. What happens if they can't make it here? I think another interesting story is what happens to this county if it's no longer has a vibrant LGBTQ community. It's so much an important part of the identity of the county. We also ask people, what are the contributions that LGBT communities make to the county? And they described all sorts of things, from values like letting people live who they are, to arts and entertainment, since we're here next to the Oscars Theater. I think my favorite quote in the whole study was, without queer people, LA would be nothing but traffic, I think, which is, which is pretty close. But I think these stories about what this means to vulnerable people in our community who live here, who want to move here, and what it means for the identities of places like LA and San Diego are really important stories to tell.
So we started a couple minutes late, so we get to go a couple minutes longer. Or did you want to?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I'm co-signing. No, co-signing on my colleagues. The other thing, this is an opportunity to advocate within your teams, right? Like, I know folks have beats. That's what you call them, right? They're like beats. Okay, all right, you got beats. One of the values, one of the things we try to do as the task force is make queer people visible where we're often invisible. So while many of you, right, are like deeply connected in covering queer people, are the folks working on housing focused in centering queer people? Are the folks who are doing some other political piece, or they're doing pop culture, or they're doing whatever the thing is, it's like, how do we begin to push Because no matter what the issue is, there is a disproportionate impact on LGBTQ people, right? It's, again, not an accident, right, that we're seeing funding being pulled from Medicaid, HUD, education, right? Like, looking at the numbers of homeless youth. Over 40% of the kids on the street identify as LGBTQ, y'all. It's like, so how do we start encouraging, demanding, offering, right? Like, who in these other places, how are they're asking the questions, right, about LGBTQ people? They're centering, who's in those numbers? Who's who's being covered in the work? I think, yeah, I'm gonna stop there. Yep.
So,
One more?
Yeah, we
right.
started a little late, so
Okay,
I'm
we
taking
have
those
one
extra
last
minutes.
question.
One more question.
Yeah, so in terms of the conversation about bringing people to the table and saying that, you know, you do not have to be ideologically pure, I'm curious how you've all been able to do that without compromising toward the right, without giving up sort of your values and saying, like, yes, we can have these conversations, you have room at the table, but also full bodily autonomy for trans people is a non-negotiable. You know, we're not going to be moving our positions anywhere else.
I love that question so much. So first, when I'm saying, like, we don't have to be purist, I'm not saying, right, like, someone's throwing a chair at you, you're like, hold on, I think we have a lot in common, right? Like, that's not what I'm talking about, right? We don't even actually have to, like, even if we just, you have to know what you have the resilience for, right? Some of us are really comfortable and not triggered talking to people right of center politically. Others of us are like, I will rip their throat out. You're not the person to talk to them. Like, that's not gonna be your role. So part of it is like knowing what you have the resilience to do, right? And then, let's be real, y'all. We have gotten so comfortable talking about the bigotry right of center that we have ignored the bigotry left of center. I used to work in the abortion rights movement, women's movement, literally worked with women who were like, well, I voted for Hillary. So what? It doesn't mean you're not still, like, you don't have work to do. Like, you have work to do. And so I think it becomes about, again, I don't see it as a compromise of values, holding people accountable. I'm not saying don't do that, right? Like, again, the principled struggle does not mean acquiesce and we don't argue or that we don't disagree. It is about, on the other side of that, do we have the capacity to stay in it with each other? Like, I can see your humanity even though you have misgendered me for the third time. And I know we care about so much of the same things. And I'm mad, I'm triggered, and I'm gonna tell you, and you're gonna say, you're right. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sorry, I keep fucking up. And I'm going to keep trying. And then I'm gonna say, keep doing that. And then let's go knock on some doors together, right? That's the piece. It's not holding people accountable. It's because you are, y'all, we can't do this work. Like, there's no way for our triggers not to come up. If we're gonna do this work in community, we are delusional if we think other people's traumas and triggers aren't gonna come up. So if we can't figure out how to find a way through it when all of our triggers are up, we're in trouble. And so how do we meet ourselves? Again, it's not like beating ourselves up, right? It's about meeting yourself where you're at, meeting other people where they're at, and then working on that resilience, right, to be able to do more, right? And so I think another example for me, I love this example. I'll give a really concrete one. In my abortion work, I was in Kansas. Anybody from Kansas? I love Kansas. town, Kansas. So we're in this, we're at the University of Kansas, we're in this room, it's packed, like with like super like feminist, like, pink hair and shaved heads and right, like they're young, they're kids, right? Almost all women in the room. It's great, we're having a great conversation. This one big 6'5" football-looking, corn-fed Kansan boy, cis man, stands up in this sea of feminists and says, well, I'm with you on sex education, but I don't agree with you on abortion. Y'all, I thought he was going to be eaten alive. The whole room erupts. They are pissed. They want to eat him for dinner. Calm the crowd down, and I said, y'all have every reason to be upset, but you missed the first part of what he said. He's with you on sex education. You're so ready to cut this off because he's not exactly where you are. You're missing an opportunity for this 6'5", corn-fed Kansas white boy to go with you to the state legislature and demand funding for the sex education policy that's on the books. Because at the time, Kansas had comprehensive sex education, but it wasn't being funded. You're missing an opportunity to build with an ally, right? Ready to cut him out. Next conversation I have with him is, you have more to do than just be anti-abortion. He was like, what do you mean? I was like, well, you still have choices to make. Are you going to be anti-abortion and scream at women outside of clinics? Are you going to be anti-abortion and go fight for sex education at your state legislature? And he was like, I never thought of it that way before. That's what I mean. There's a way for us to be in conversation. And again, this binary, y'all, we're queers. We don't believe in the binary.
That's right.
Right? And so what does that look like? It's not you're just abortion for or against abortion. How are you going to show up not being for abortion? Are you going to shame people? Are you going to work on passing laws that prevent this person from getting the abortion they need? Are you going to actually use that energy to do something right on the other side of this? And that's a space we can get to, but it's not transactional, and it's not fast, and it isn't a quote. It isn't coming at people in a purist way. And it takes practice, because we really do have to tend to our own traumas, right, and honor where our own resiliency is.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah, go ahead, Shelby, sure.
I think what Kiera's saying is spot on, and I also think that it's like when it comes to trans kids in healthcare, society has real freakouts. And there's probably people in this room who are like, well, I'm like down for the trans agenda, but I don't know about the kids getting healthcare. And I think part of it is like a narrative issue. It's like, how are we, uh-oh, did I kill you?
I'm down with the trans agenda, y'all.
But it's like, we also have to, I think, like accurately explain this information. And it's not about, we're literally talking about healthcare. Like that's all it is. And like the more that I think as a society we can understand that when we want to say trans kids can't access healthcare, we're basically saying no one deserves healthcare. But there's still a lot of people who think, well, if we let trans kids have health care, it means they're going to have all these surgery. And it's like, any of the trans people in the room, we're here to tell you, little kids are not getting surgeries because they have health care. They're literally saving their lives. That's all that's happening. But how do we start to tell that longer arc story around just health care for everyone?
Totally true. I will add one thing, and then we really do need to finish up, because there might be people outside who want to get in here. I was at a workshop this weekend, and Travell Anderson made an incredible suggestion that I hope all of you take into account, which is that gender-affirming care is not just for transgender people. And how about we do that list, that BuzzFeedy, as they said, BuzzFeedy list of like, what does gender-affirming care look like? And I cannot thank you all enough. This was extraordinary. I appreciate every single one of you. This is this is one of the most powerful plenaries we've had, and also this is why our staff meetings are called Church of Kiera. So I just want to thank all of you, and we'll hang out after and stay for, I know more people had questions, and so I apologize we didn't get to everybody, but thank you so much for being here. Have a great rest of the day.